Imagine a love so consumed by ghosts that it could not survive its own tenderness. What happens when an immortal soldier is cursed to love a woman possessed by the voices of every ancestor who ever lived? Duncan Idaho died for the Atreides, again and again, across thousands of years, only to be resurrected each time by the cold science of the Tleilaxu masters. And Alia Atreides, born with the full conscious memory of billions of lives already burning inside her mind, was never truly allowed to be a child, a woman, or a human being at all. Their romance was not simply a love story. It was a catastrophe written in stars, the collision of two souls that existence itself had already broken before they ever reached for each other. This is the haunting, voluptuous, and ultimately devastating story of Alia and Duncan. Two people the universe denied the most ordinary gift of all, a life fully their own. To understand why their bond was so intoxicating and so fatal, we must first understand what each of them actually was. Not who they appeared to be, but what had been done to them and what they carried. Alia Atreides entered the world, already ancient. Her mother, the Lady Jessica, underwent the Spice Agony during her pregnancy on Arrakis, consuming the water of life, the transmuted bile of a drowned sandworm, in a ritual that was never meant for a woman with child. For Jessica, it was an ordeal of awakening. For the unborn Alia, it was something else entirely. The raw flood of ancestral memory, the accumulated consciousness of every Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother in Jessica's genetic line, poured through the barrier between mother and daughter and lit up the mind of a fetus who had not yet drawn a single breath. Alia was born awake in a way no human child had ever been born awake before. She arrived in the world already inhabited. The Bene Gesserit had a word for this. They called it Abomination. It was not a word of cruelty, though cruelty lived inside it. It was a word of diagnosis and of dread. A preborn, a child who had absorbed the other memory in the womb, was considered fundamentally unstable. The theory was precise and terrible. Every human carried the residual ghosts of ancestry deep in genetic memory, accessible only through the controlled ordeal of the Spice Agony in adulthood, when the ego was strong enough to face those voices and remain sovereign. But a preborn had no such developed ego. The voices arrived before the self. And so the self, when it finally grew crowded. It grew contested. The ancient minds already resident in that small body did not disappear. They waited. They whispered. And the strongest among them looked for weakness, looked for a crack in the wall of the present self, and pushed. Alia fought those voices for years. She was, by every outward measure, formidable. She was a trained warrior, a Bene Gesserit adept of staggering capability, a political mind of razor precision. And she was beautiful in the way of the Atreides, that combination of dark desert vitality and aristocratic bone structure that made people stop thinking clearly in her presence. She carried herself with an authority that seemed not to be performed, but simply to exist in her, the way gravity exists in a planet. She was also utterly, profoundly alone. Now let us speak of Duncan Idaho, and let us be honest about what the Tleilaxu made of him. Duncan Idaho was, in the original flesh, one of the greatest human beings who ever served House Atreides. He was the sword master, the loyal retainer, the man who had died holding a corridor so that young Paul and Lady Jessica could escape the Harkonnen invasion of Arrakis. He died killing the last of his attackers with wounds that should have killed him far earlier. He was the kind of man about whom legends attach naturally, not because he sought them, but because the quality of his devotion simply demanded a story to carry it. And then the Tleilaxu, those enigmatic and morally complex masters of axolotl biology, grew him back. They called him Hayt. They sent him as a gift to the God Emperor Paul Muad'Dib, a Ghola of Duncan, Idaho, a perfect physical recreation of the man, complete to the last scar and muscle memory, but stripped of everything he had ever remembered. He did not know who he was. He knew only what the Tleilaxu had added to him, mentat conditioning, the highest order of human computational and analytical intelligence, and the training of a Zen-Sunni philosopher and a combat master of the Zen-Sunni schools. He was, in other words, rebuilt as a weapon of exquisite sophistication and sent directly into the court of the woman who would most need him. Not Paul, Alia. The irony was so elegant, it seemed designed by something that enjoyed cruelty. The Tleilaxu had conditioned Hayt to kill Paul Muad'Dib. The Ghola was programmed as an assassin, a sleeper weapon meant to be triggered by the right psychological pressure. But what actually happened when the memories broke through, when the conditioning cracked and Duncan Idaho remembered himself, was that the killing impulse dissolved in the face of love for the Atreides. He could not do it. The original Duncan's devotion was too deep, too fundamental to his cellular identity, and the Ghola chose, freely and at enormous cost, to reclaim who he was rather than fulfill what he had been made to do. Paul was gone not long after, walking into the desert, blind, fulfilling the Fremen ritual of giving his body to the sand, and Alia remained. Regent of the known universe, ruler of Arrakis, guardian of the spice, mother figure to Paul's twin children, Leto and Ghanima, and utterly, catastrophically alone with the voices. It is here that the romance truly begins, and here that we must speak of it with the care it deserves. Because what passed between Alia and Duncan Idaho was not a simple matter of political convenience or lonely proximity, though both of those things were real. What existed between them had a quality that the word romance barely contains. It was older and stranger and more desperate than that. Duncan was, to Alia, the one living person who could look at her and see something other than what she represented. To the great houses, she was a symbol of divine terror. To the Fremen, she was the sister of the prophet. To the Bene Gesserit, she was a cautionary tale. To the Spacing Guild and the merchants and the plotters, she was an obstacle or a tool. But Duncan had known Paul. Duncan had known Jessica. Duncan had been bred in his very cells to love the Atreides. And that love, when it recognized Alia, was neither political nor transactional. It was helpless. It was the recognition of something precious and endangered by a man whose deepest instinct was to protect. And Alia, for her part, felt in Duncan the most extraordinary sensation she had ever experienced. The sensation of being seen without being evaluated. His mentat mind could assess her capabilities with clinical exactitude, yes. But what he directed at her in the quiet hours, in the spaces between duty and performance, was something far warmer. He looked at her the way the desert looks at a single green thing growing in the sand, with astonishment, with a kind of reverent disbelief that something this alive had managed to survive here. Their closeness was written in the texture of their days together. The way she sought his counsel, not because she needed it strategically, but because his voice organized the noise inside her head into something bearable. The way he positioned himself in rooms, always knowing where she was, always within reach, without crowding. She was a woman of volcanic intensity, and he was the only person she knew who was not frightened by that intensity, who met it with a steadiness that felt less like calm and more like an equivalent but different fire. She was heat. He was iron. And what they made together in those years of the Regency, in the corridors of the Citadel on Arrakis, and the political chambers of the Imperium, was something that looked from the outside like governance and from the inside like the only warmth either of them had ever trusted. There was a physical dimension to this that the story does not fully speak aloud, but which breathes between every line of it. Alia was a woman of profound and complicated relationship to her own body. She was preternaturally aware of everything her flesh could do. Every Bene Gesserit discipline of control and sensation available to her. And yet she was also haunted by bodies, specifically by the accumulated bodily memories of all those ancestors pressing against her consciousness. What Duncan offered her was something no ancestor could reach, a presence that was entirely in the present tense. When he was near her, the voices were quieter. When he touched her, the past retreated. She was not a vessel in those moments. She was simply herself. And for a woman who had never truly known what that felt like, it was intoxicating in a way that transcended any physical pleasure. It was the intoxication of personhood, of being, for once, nobody's inheritance. But the voices did not stay quiet. And this is where the story turns from something voluptuous into something tragic, with a slowness that makes the tragedy worse, not better. The Baron Harkonnen had been Alia's maternal great-grandfather. Vladimir Harkonnen, the gross and brilliant architect of cruelty, the man who had worked for decades to destroy House Atreides, was present in Alia's ancestral memory with a particularity and a strength that was out of proportion to his position in the genetic line. The Bene Gesserit had always understood this risk. The most dominant personalities in the ancestral memory were not necessarily the most virtuous ones. They were the ones with the most consolidated will, the ones who had made themselves so singular in life that their imprint on genetic memory was correspondingly massive. The Baron was exactly such a personality. And in Alia, who was already compromised by the preborn condition, already suffering the fundamental instability of a self that had grown up in a crowd, he found his opening. It did not happen all at once. That would have been almost merciful. It happened in degrees so gradual that even Duncan, watching her with the full precision of his mentat faculties, could not always see exactly where the line was. She would speak, and her speech would shift slightly, become more indulgent, more contemptuous, more laced with a kind of cold appetite that was not Alia. She would make decisions that were technically defensible, but that had a flavor to them, a relish in the exercise of power that seemed to come from somewhere else. She was still Alia when she was with him. Or she was still most Alia, but the margins were changing. Duncan understood, with the merciless clarity of his mentat training, what was happening. He understood it in the same way a physician understands the progression of a disease they cannot stop but must continue to chart. The woman he loved was being consumed from within. The enemy was not outside. The enemy was her bloodline, and there was no sword in existence that could answer that threat. He stayed. This is the part that breaks the heart of the story. He stayed not out of passivity or denial, but out of an active, considered, mentat-calculated choice to remain present for as long as any part of her was still there. His love for Alia was not the love of a man for a stable and uncomplicated partner. It was the love of a person for another person who was fighting a war no one else could see, and his presence was his testimony that he saw it, that he was witness to her courage even as she lost. He served her as regent, as advisor, as the warm and certain anchor she returned to when the Baron's voice grew too loud and she needed desperately to remember who she was. He was the only one she ever fully trusted. And he knew, with the same mentat precision that made his love possible, exactly how that trust was being slowly corrupted. The Baron learning to use Alia's love for Duncan as a lever, whispering suggestions that arrived in her mind, wearing the texture of her own desires. Now we must speak of the twins. Leto and Ghanima, the children of Paul, Muad'Dib, and Chani, were also preborn after a fashion. They carried the other memory, but they had each other. They had developed a mutual defense, a technique of holding each other's names and identities across the ancestral flood, and this had allowed them to remain, at least partly, themselves. Alia had no such partner. She had only Duncan, who was not preborn and could not share her interior landscape, only love her across the divide of it. The twins were in danger. This was the unbearable calculation that Duncan eventually could no longer avoid. Alia, under the influence of the Baron, had become a threat to her own nephew and niece. The woman who had been their guardian was being turned into something that regarded them as obstacles to power rather than children to be loved. And the longer Duncan waited, the deeper the Baron's hold became, and the closer Leto and Ghanima came to a fate their aunt would not have consciously chosen for them. He chose to die, not passively, not by accident or by enemy action. Duncan Idaho, with full mentat awareness of every consequence, engineered a confrontation that he knew would end with his death, because his death was the only signal left that could wake Leto and Ghanima to the full extent of what was happening. He was, in the most precise sense, sacrificing himself as information, his body as a message, his death as a thing that would finally move the people he needed to move. This act is simultaneously the most rational and the most devastating thing in the entire story. He ran the calculations. He saw the outcomes. He saw that a living Duncan staying at Alia's side would eventually become merely a tool of the Baron's governance, his love turned into a blindfold over his own eyes. He saw that a dead Duncan was an event Alia herself, might still grieve authentically, might still reach through the Baron's voice to mourn, and that this grief might be Alia's last act as herself. And he saw that for the twins, the death of the one man they knew to be utterly trustworthy was a signal of emergency that could not be ignored or explained away. He loved her well enough to stop trying to save her and to save the legacy she would have wanted to protect. There is nothing more heartbreaking in the Dune universe than a man dying for a woman, not to save her life, but to honor what her life had meant before the darkness took it. After Duncan, after the unraveling of the Regency, after Alia's final collapse, the story does not end, it multiplies. The Tleilaxu continued to grow Duncan Idaho. Ghola after Ghola, life after life, across the millennia of Leto II's God-Emperor reign. Leto, who was no longer entirely human, who had fused his body with the sand trout that were transforming him into something vast and prescient and terrible, kept commissioning new Duncans. He did this for reasons both personal and strategic. On the personal level, Leto loved the memory of Duncan Idaho with a kind of affection that does not diminish across thousands of years. On the strategic level, Duncan's predictable resistance to authority, his constitutional inability to simply submit to power he found unjust, made him the perfect variable in Leto's long game. A universe full of people trained to comply needed at least one person structurally incapable of it. But there is another reason the Duncans kept coming back, and it has everything to do with Alia. Each new Duncan Ghola, when his original memories broke through in the Awakening Crisis, received not just his own past, but the entire lineage of the Ghola succession. Each one knew, eventually, what his predecessor had known. Each one felt, in some cellular echo, the particular ache of the relationship with Alia, not as a direct memory in all cases, but as a pattern, a shape in the personality, an instinctive wariness around certain kinds of love, a learned understanding of what it means to watch someone you adore be eaten alive from within. The subsequent Duncans carried what scholars of the Dune universe have come to call the Alia pattern. It was not grief, exactly. It was something more structural than grief. It was the understanding, written into who each Duncan was becoming, that devotion without sovereignty is not love at all. That staying beside someone as they destroy themselves is not loyalty, but a form of enabling. And that the most loving act in the universe might sometimes be the one that looks, from the outside, like abandonment. This pattern shaped every Duncan's relationship with the Atreides bloodline and the concept of rebellion. He kept refusing, he kept questioning, he kept placing the honest assessment above the comfortable one, even when the honest assessment hurt. Not because he had learned to care less, but because Alia had taught him, through the catastrophe of their love, exactly what caring without judgment costs everyone involved. Leto, watching all of this across the centuries, was not indifferent to the poetry of it. He was the universe's greatest student of human pattern and human tragedy, and what he saw in the recurring Duncan cycle was something he considered a form of necessary suffering. Duncan's capacity for devastating love, for love that met catastrophe and survived it in changed form, was part of what made him the instrument Leto needed. A man who had never loved ruinously would not have the particular kind of resilience that ruinous love produces. And so we come at last to the collapse itself, to the final accounting of what Alia and Duncan had built and broken and left behind. The Atreides dynasty, by the time of Alia's regency, was already living on borrowed time in ways that no one fully wanted to acknowledge. Paul had begun the jihad. Millions upon millions had died in the name of Muad'Dib, the desert prophet whose prescient vision had first horrified him and then consumed him. The empire built on his name was vast and brittle, in the specific way that empires built on religious fervor are always brittle, because they cannot adapt without appearing to deny their own foundations. Alia had held it together by sheer force of personality and political cunning for years. But a personality is not a principle, and cunning is not a foundation. What she was building was a brilliant and unstable structure, with her own fracturing mind at the center of it, and everyone who depended on the structure was depending, ultimately, on whether Alia could hold herself together. She could not. The Baron won, in the end, inside the only arena that mattered. Alia threw herself from the temple wall in the moments after the twins' liberation and their destruction of what she had become. The Bene Gesserit looked at this and said, "We told you." The Fremen said she was taken by the desert. The historian said the Regency collapsed. And somewhere in all of those accounts, the actual human being, the woman who had loved Duncan Idaho and had wanted nothing more than a few years of relative silence in her own head, was swallowed by the category she had been assigned at birth. Abomination, as if that word explained anything, as if that word was a substitute for the grief of understanding what she actually lost. The Duncan Idaho who lived through that era, the one who had made his calculated sacrifice, was of course dead before her final fall. He did not see it. Perhaps that was the only mercy in the whole arrangement. He had died while she was still partly herself. He had died while she could still be mourned as someone who had once been fully present, fully alive, fully the woman he had reached for across the impossible distance of what they both were. What he left behind was not just the memory of their love, but the question that their love poses to everyone who encounters the Dune. Universe's great themes of determinism and free will. Were they ever truly free to love each other? Or was the tragedy always already written in the architecture of what the Bene Gesserit breeding program, the Tleilaxu axolotl tanks, and the Spice Agony had made of them? Can something be a genuine romance if both parties were shaped deliberately and without their consent to be exactly the kinds of people who would collide in exactly this way? The answer that the Dune universe seems to offer, obliquely and without comfort, is this: it does not matter. The question of whether their love was free does not change the fact that it was real. The question of whether Alia could have been saved does not change the fact that Duncan tried. The question of whether the Ghola's love was programmed does not change the fact that he chose, freely and at cost, to express it through sacrifice rather than compliance. Free will in the Dune universe is never the freedom to escape your nature. It is the freedom to decide what you do with your nature, even when your nature is terrible, even when your nature is a dead man grown in a tank, even when your nature is an ancient and haunted woman who cannot stop the voices. The final Duncan Idaho, who lives through the events of Chapter House, Dune, and passes into an escape beyond the known universe, with the Bene Gesserit Merbella and the fugitives from Leto's golden path, carries all of this with him. He has been Hayt, and he has been the Duncan of Alia's court, and he has been a dozen other Gholas across a span of time that beggars imagination. And he carries, in the particular tenderness and particular caution with which he approaches the women he loves in those final pages, the inheritance of what Alia taught him: not to love less, never to love less, but to love with open eyes, to love in a way that protects the beloved's sovereignty even at the cost of one's own comfort, to love in a way that does not require the other person to stay exactly who they are in order to remain worthy of love, but that also does not allow love to become the alibi for watching someone disappear. The legacy of Alia and Duncan is, in the end, not merely the cautionary tale it is sometimes described as, the warning against the abomination condition or the risks of Ghola psychology or the dangers of preborn children. That reading is too clinical. It strips the story of its blood. The real legacy is the image of two people, each denied the most fundamental human experience of simply growing up as themselves, finding in each other a temporary reprieve from the noise of everything that was not them. The way she quieted in his presence, the way he returned to her even knowing what she was becoming. The extravagant, reckless, fully conscious choice to love someone who might not survive that love, and to be transformed by the loving even when the story does not end well. There is no clean resolution to this romance. There is no moment when the universe says they deserved better and corrects itself. There's only the long, trailing echo of their connection across thousands of years of Dune history, In every Duncan who ever paused before speaking an uncomfortable truth to someone he loved, in every account that tried to explain Alia as mere madness and failed to account for the grief that attended her fall, in every reader who closed the book and felt that something had been taken from them that they had not been warned about. What happens when an immortal soldier is cursed to love a woman possessed by the ghosts of her ancestors? He loves her anyway. He watches. He stays, as long as staying serves her. He leaves when leaving is the only thing left he can give. And then he carries her with him in every life after, as the specific and irreplaceable weight of having loved someone the universe was not willing to protect.